This week on Hope City Overtime, we talk about sin and our response to sin, whether we'll choose to be a carrier of a disease or the antidote. We got a bunch of funny stories in this one. Make sure you like, subscribe. Let's get it.
Welcome to Hope City Overtime, a weekly podcast where we take a little more time to dive into Sunday's message. And we are right in the middle of the Roman series. This week was Sin Part 2, which was a little less weighty than the week before. But you guys talked about really the practical, like if this is what sin is and this is how God responds to sin, then this is how we respond to sin. And to kick it off, you talked about this idea of instrument, which was not like a musical instrument, but more like a tool. So for our light, we're not going to dive in just like we did last week. The light question is, if you could only have one tool, what would be your like go-to tool that you kept?
Impact.
I was just
Literally
about to say
gonna
that.
say
I don't even know what that
Change
is.
the bits.
Yep. Impact drill.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
That was a quick answer. Sorry.
I know.
Boom.
We all agree.
If
But I
it's
mean, I feel like
anything
that's
but
kinda
an
cheating
impact drill, what would be your go-to? And if someone says the answer, you can't say the same one.
Oh, man.
So answer fast.
Man, okay, hold on.
Utility knife.
Ooh, yeah.
Like a box.
Yeah,
a
that's
good
a good
box cutter. Come on, somebody. I don't know why I'm so excited about a box
Yeah.
cutter.
Joey would be proud.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm just go classic, a hammer.
Oh my gosh, everyone's saying the ones that I promise I know a lot about tools.
I know.
I know. Okay, can you say like an air tool, kind of like a
Sure.
pneumatic?
I know nothing about tools, so you can basically say whatever you want to. And
Why not air compressor? That's what I'm
There
gonna
you
go
go.
with.
okay,
You can change your tools there, but I mean, if I only have one,
yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, well.
yeah. Just curious, Try not to dive right into
right.
right into sin. So there we go. Mine would be a spatula because I don't do anything with building, but I like to cook, and that's the most versatile tool in the kitchen.
what about a pen or a pencil?
Ooh, like a writing utensil.
I would argue that a good knife is used in all those applications.
It's
Sharpening
true.
the pencil,
That's true.
cutting up whatever you're putting in.
Also,
Yeah.
carve
Yep.
something in a
And you
tree.
chop a
There you
lot.
go.
But I have one of those like stick the vegetable on it and then just push down and it chops
Yeah,
everything.
come on,
Those
somebody.
are nice. They save a lot of time, but then they
Oh, yeah.
break. But anyway, it's because I'm so strong. So instruments.
Wow.
It just last week I got criticized for going right in. So this week we're starting at the
That's it.
surface and moving slowly. You basically had this premise that there are two ways we can respond to sin, which is a given. Like we're kind of stepping in with the understanding all of us struggle with this idea, this condition of sin, is that we can be carriers of the disease or carriers of the antidote. And so the first thing we kind of talked about is disease. And you found this incredible story about chemical warfare that I don't know if it hit every service. So can you do like a really brief 2-minute, like what this chemical warfare
Sure.
story
So
was?
the story is told, and some historians go back and forth on this, but the story is told that in the 14th century, the Mongolian army attacked a city called Kaffa.
Kaffa.
Kaffa. Yeah, Kaffa. There you
It's
go.
in present-day Ukraine.
Yes, present-day Ukraine. Michaela did a phenomenal job of doing some of the research on this. But the beauty of Kaffa's defense was that they had a really strong wall, but they also backed up to a body of water because they were a port city. Traditionally, when the Mongolian army would attack a city that had a decent-sized wall, they would basically choke the city off from all its supply lines. So they would surround it entirely, not allow anybody in or out. And when food started drying up, military supplies would dry up. It would just weaken the city, eventually having the city fall. So they basically learned how to wait people out. Problem with Kaffa is if they were going to do that, they'd be
have to be
there
in the
for
ocean
a
too,
long,
yeah.
long time. So what ended up happening is while they were waiting, the Black Death started showing up in the camp. So Mongolian soldiers were dying of this disease. And so what the Mongolian army decided to do in order to weaken the city was to take the corpses of those who had freshly died and begin to toss them over the walls in hopes that they would infect those behind the wall, again, weakening the city in its stronghold. What they didn't know that they were doing is not only weakening the city, but because, again, it was a port city, a lot of people had escaped to the water, jumped on ships, transported that disease to Europe. And by the time it was said and done, it had taken off a good chunk of the world's population because of that contagion. because of the way that disease spread. So it was a worldwide pandemic that took out a large percentage of the known world population at the time. So yeah, that's the illustration that we presented in order to communicate the dangers of sin. Again, it wasn't that the corpses in themselves.
Yeah, that's what I
spread
want to
the
get
death.
into,
Yeah.
the difference between death and disease.
So maybe cutting room floor. To learn a little bit about the way that these infections were spread, there are 3 type of spreading mechanisms. There's disease that spread through blood, disease that spread through air, and then disease that spread through touch. When the corpse is dead, the virus can still potentially live through one of those 3 areas. If there's no breath, it can't live in breath. If there's no blood or the blood's been drained, then it can't. What more than likely happened in more cases than not is as these corpses were flung over, they were collected, put in piles. Animals, insects, mosquitoes would then bite in, draw from the infected blood, and pass it on to other people. And so ultimately, the picture that we are trying to paint, it's not a pretty picture, a little morbid way of approaching a Sunday morning, but that really sin needs a carrier. Like that we are carriers of this disease. And if we're not careful, specifically the way that Paul writes, it's the reason why he has such harsh words to those who encourage sin in others, because we can fan into flame some of that death that people carry with them. And so that was the picture, that we can choose our first response. We can choose to be carriers of the disease and to encourage not just the disease in our own life, but the disease and sin in others.
So all of you made this point, like using this illustration and talking about how it's not the death that's contagious, it's the disease that's contagious. And I want to kind of talk through that a little bit. It wasn't the main point of the sermon, but we just had this whole big series earlier in the year called Wake the Dead. We talked about how we want to be people who aren't afraid of the stench of death. Like, we're going to be all around this. And it can almost sound like then when you're preaching a message and it's like, well, sin is infectious through this disease and we need to flee from sin, to stay away from sin. Just want to talk through what it looks like to be people who follow Jesus, who are doing our best to stay away from this disease of sin, but still not afraid to go into those places where there's death. So that's kind of the topic of conversation, if you will, more than a question, because I do think it can be confusing to be like, well, a couple months ago they were like, run into the grave, don't be afraid of the stench. And now it's like, but look at this disease of sin and how it causes all this death. So maybe I'm the only one who wanted to talk through that. But
No, I think it's within the scope of the writing. I think there's a clarity in why we made the point to say that sin, that death is not contagious in and of itself, is because we are called to go to those dead places, right? That's the other response to this, is that we would carry the antidote. I think we just need to learn how to live aware. To be in but not of means that I'm aware. And what's the sense of carrying the antidote if you're not around sick people, right? Like the objective of the antidote is to bring it to sick people. So I think there's a clarity there within the scope of even the language that Paul writes. Like, he is quick to, and we can kind of parse through some of this, but he's quick to point the finger at the sinful nature, but then reminds us that there's repentance, there's this beauty of the antidote that's made available through Jesus. So to your point, it's the reason we made that distinction. It's not that you would find yourself isolated from people, but there is a awareness of sin that you should carry. I think that's wisdom, that as you navigate life next to people who have lived in this place of death, who haven't come to the full understanding of Jesus, that you're living a life of but not in. That there's a there's a proximity, but it's not that you're living aware of the sin that can grab a hold of us. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that's
fully,
helpful.
But, yeah.
Did you have other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that we wouldn't want to live in those circles of the disease. Like, if we have the antidote, I would hope that we have already partaken of that antidote, so we won't necessarily get sick. But, taking it super practically, after you visit sick people, like, obviously you're going to wash your hands and stuff, and you take those precautions because you know it's a disease. And the people that are living in that death and in that disease, like, they're not aware of that. So they're not taking those precautions either. So they're more apt to spreading that disease. And it's just the stark opposite with us. So, yeah. But that's a really good observation. I really liked that. I haven't thought about that.
That's what I do. I sit through 2 services if I'm not preaching. So it's like I get extra time to be like, I'm going to ask about this on the podcast. I just keep a note on my phone. I'm not texting if anyone's looking around. I'm taking notes on what to ask on the podcast. My brain goes to COVID because, like,
That's what we
how
know.
can you not? And I know so much of COVID became politicized. But if you think back to, like, the very beginning, 2 things came to mind in this sermon. And so we're kind of jumping all over the place. But, like, do you remember when they had no idea how to treat it? And so, like, if someone got sick and they were in the hospital, like, remember when they learned that if you flipped people over on their stomachs, that would help? And suddenly that news spread so fast, like, because it was, here's this thing. We're not at vaccines yet. Like, we've literally just learned that if we flip these people over, they're more likely to live. And so, like, people wanted to share that so quickly. So that's the first thing that I thought about when you guys were talking about we do have the antidote, like, why John got on his soapbox a little bit in the 11 o'clock service at West. But I loved what you said because you talked about how people will know our political affiliations. They'll know where we go to the gym. They'll know what schools we went to or where our kids go to school. They'll know all these things about us before they know who we belong to. But if Jesus is the antidote, why is that not the first thing? Why is that not like, hey, have you learned that if you give them this medicine, it helps? Or, like life-saving information. So this is just like story time with Ashley, the things I took away about COVID. But then the other one was we learned how to protect ourselves. So, like, it's not saying be foolish and walk into these places where, particularly if you've struggled with certain areas or habits before, it may not be a great thing if you've struggled with alcohol to walk right back into a bar. For some people, that might be okay. For some, that's not wise. We can also have the protections, like washing our hands or whatever your proverbial mask is, to not have that disease come back, but to still be able to step into these places.
Well, I think the reason there's tension in the conversation is because there's tension in the process. Like, this isn't anything that's simple. It requires wisdom. It requires maturation. Like, if you're new in the faith, probably should spend some time learning what God says about you before you jump back into the lion's den, for lack of a better term. Sometimes it's situational, and a lot of it's relational, right? Like, who are these people that we're doing life with? Like, you may not have a choice. It could be someone who lives in your home. So the reason that you sense attention and I sense attention, even when you read through Romans and you sense attention, and I believe it's because Paul is even communicating that tension. Like, this is not easy. It's not. It's not easy to do life alongside people. And yet, again, because that, not to jump ahead, but that proximity and pressing concept, right? If I do life alongside, I put my guard down. There's tendencies of being like a little bit more vulnerable in some of those spaces. And before you know it, now I am struggling to navigate my own journey with sin. And that can be challenging. So yeah, I do think that tension's intentional.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You look like you've got wisdom, but I don't want to put you on the spot. I just am like, I feel like his brain's doing a lot. Whenever it's ready and formulated, just interrupt. You talked about some of the ways that, like, what it looks like in 2025 to encourage sin, because I think sometimes we have in our heads that thing. Do you remember when they did, like, don't do drug classes?
The DARE?
Yeah, and they would be like, oh my gosh, the peer pressure. They're going to be like, here, do these things. And like the reality was, at least for me, it was never that cut and dry as like, oh my gosh, there's this Billy's around the corner and he's trying to push his drugs
Didn't you
on me.
go to a Christian academy?
No.
Oh,
I went to a
you did.
private school, but it wasn't Christian. But I was in public school until high school.
That's true.
But it's more subtle than that. And I think sometimes as Christians, we think like, oh, well, the way that this disease is spread, it's going to be so obvious. Like, it's just going to be this person around the corner who's like, do all this bad stuff. But it's it can be a lot more subtle than that. And so you gave some examples. This is where you sang Live Your Life. If you want, there we go.
Hey.
Is in my head still. You Do You is one that you guys gave, but what are some ways that you see in 2025 people being carriers of this disease of sin that may not be as obvious as like, here, try some sin?
I think one of the cleverest ways is how we've introduced your truth. So my truth, no matter how wrong it may be to someone else, it's my truth. So it now, in many ways, qualifies the way I stand and how I choose to live, because that might not be your truth, but this is my truth, and I can apply that in any context. I think that is one of the just smartest ways for the enemy to deceive so much, because now we're no longer subject to one finality of a truth. It's like, well, no, you get your own version of the truth, and that's yours. So live by it. Be true to that. It sounds so good, poetic. It sounds right, but it's so destructive. And you hear people say that all the time, well, this is my truth. So, yeah, I think that is so dangerous for us to live there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You can do it in song form if you're more comfortable that way.
No, I think to that point, like, we have been, as a culture, we have been slowly but surely, the voice of the church has been villainized. Some of that is by our own hand. So like, that's not just everybody else's fault. Some of that's by our own corruption, by our own sinful nature, by just generations worth of some of that. I will also say some of that is the hand of the enemy at work within our culture right now. So, but what ends up happening is it's the sin of omission versus the sin of commission. I think we do not engage in areas that we should out of fear of offense, out of fear of being marginalized or being identified and labeled. And it's a challenge that we struggle with even as a church. Like, there is a tendency within the scope of our cultural climate right now to say, oh, well, that's this type of church or that type of church. So what ends up happening is we withhold the truth that people need for the nature of this disease, right? We don't talk about sin. We don't try to spend time creating a picture of what the standard is biblically. And because of so much of that, I think some of the sin of omission, because we're not doing these things, does encourage sinful lifestyles. It is what it is. And what I've noticed is the more we do that, we may shut the message down, but the product of life that's lived outside of the standard that's set by the Spirit, it's a law. Like, it's going to happen. Like, sin will produce death. And we're seeing more and more death and wondering why, because the message of truth is being silent. So I think some of this is the sin of omission versus the sin of commission when it comes to the way that we encourage death.
How do you know how to address this in the lives
Great
of people
question.
you love? Like, because I do think there are places where we absolutely need to speak. And then there are places where it's just like, at this point, the person's made a decision, or like, I don't only want to talk about this issue every time we get together. So just how do you engage that practically?
Yeah, I'll say something real quick, and I know that you both have some concept there. First of all, in my personal life, there are relatives and people who I love dearly who don't have the same understanding of the gospel or agree with the Jesus that I agree with and given my life to. So there are moments where that is a part of the conversation. So with that said, first of all, relational equity. I'm big, Jess and I are quick to invest, to encourage, to love on, to spend time with, so that they can see the love of Jesus through me. And when they have the question, I'm ready with the answer. I will tell you, more often than not, we have found that it's my lifestyle that draws the question versus their lifestyle that draws the question. Like, you guys are in church quite a bit. What's that about? Or, we've noticed you made this decision with your family. What's that about? So where we have chosen to draw the line is by setting standards within the scope of our personal nuclear family. I mean, just as a, like, there's some things that if I will never have a conversation with outside of my house. We might if in a moment of relational equity, in a moment of sobriety, we may be sitting down over a cup of coffee and you ask me a question and I'll speak. Or if I feel led by the Spirit, very important, being moved by the Spirit, to have a conversation with you about something, that I'll have that conversation. But if you try to bring that standard into my home around my boys, that's when in my head, great opportunity for me to sit down and explain my why. Right. And it's not in a lack of love. There's all kind of love there, but I just need you to know in my home, this is our standard. This is kind of what we're developing. So people who are really close to us, often that question will arise based off the way that I'm living, not the way they're living. But again, led by the Spirit, there are moments where that conversation is necessary. You just have to trust in the Spirit of God and do the relational work. I think that's important too.
Yeah.
You guys are shaking their heads. If you're
yeah,
watching this online, people
I
just shaking their head.
Yeah, I think for me, being Spirit-led is going to be key. I think the enemy he's been doing this for a long time, so he is really good at what he does. And I'm learning more and more how he creates confusion and how that confusion robs us of so much. So I think there is a heavy cloud of confusion all around us where we don't even know how to address subject, because in one sense, me just loving them quietly and knowing I'm here for you and not saying anything is love and is keeping the peace. For me to address something that I know might be awkward or delicate to you, that might not be perceived as peaceful. Now I don't even know what my move should be. I think it's simply a state of confusion that the enemy put us in, because we got one crowd that is like looking for those folks to go after and try to clean them up. You have another crowd that does absolutely nothing. You have people that are broken and they want to do something. They don't really have a lot of examples around them, and they're trying to figure out, what do I do? What do I say? What sounds loving? What doesn't sound loving? What's my tone need to be? When do they invite me, and do they even invite me in? And you're juggling all this, and you just don't know what to do. And I chalk it back up to just the confusing state that we're in. You got to be led by the Spirit, but the reality is this world hated Jesus. They hated him. I don't want to seek to be hated, but I can't be scared to be hated as well and to be judged. We can try to keep the peace and hold off on sharing certain things in love. The moment you share it, again, whether they're going to receive it or not, is not on you. But that whole time of you waiting, it might have just prolonged the rejection that they were inevitably going to give you, and now they threw you in that boat. I can't be so concerned about that. I need to be more concerned when I stand before the Lord and he asks me about the life that I live with the antidote, the cure that I had. What did I do with it?
Yeah.
And I think, again, when the enemy can bring confusion to where now we're second guessing certain things that we knew were straight love through and through.
Yeah.
Now I'm wondering, is this love? This doesn't sound love. This sounds mean, and this is hurtful. And then I don't know. It is a confusing state, and we just have to keep ourselves connected to the Spirit and just know this world hated us, hated him. So there's a good chance it's going to hate us too. And just accept the reward is great and is worth it, just living for him and kind of staying close to him.
Yeah. I think in my circles, I have people that are very close to my family and I that don't love Jesus. And the first thing that I have to remember is not to attach the disagreements to their person, is separate them, because at the end of the day, they are a relative, they are a loved one, and making sure that I just don't subliminally not resent them, but just feel at odds with them. And then also, I think that a lot of people are more scared to share the truth because it's the fear of the unknown, and a lot of people are willing to have a conversation more than you realize. So, there's a pretty good chance if you have a relationship with someone that's very strong, you're really not going to offend them. And what I've learned in these circles is highlighting my humanity works wonders, whenever I talk about a certain sin and I'm like, hey, this is because I live by the Bible, but P.S. I also struggle with this sin, I struggle with pride, and the Bible says don't do that. And, just as an example. So also just making it known, hey, I am human. We all fall short of the glory of God. that's just been crucial in me sharing Jesus with other people, because the minute that they forget or they feel like I've gotten a little bit more lax with my stance on the Bible, like that's the moment that like I can't let happen, because I feel like it's my biblical duty for the people around me not to feel like I'm affirming of sin or in any way, shape, or form, but rather, hey, I'm going to love you in despite of this. It's just like the moment last week that Pastor John said, no, I think it was last week, it might have been 2 weeks ago, that it's like, no, I hate the sickness, not the child that's sick, you know? So that's what I found to be helpful.
Yeah. I do think it's important in these conversations to specify that it is different having a conversation with someone who does not know or claim to follow the Lord versus having a conversation about sin with someone who does follow the Lord. I think they're both important conversations to have, but and you guys can disagree with me, but I don't know that I would necessarily start with a conversation around sin if I'm talking to someone who, why would I expect them to follow the teachings of Jesus if they don't claim or want to follow the teachings of Jesus? Like, those are different versus a friend that we've prayed together and we've walked through life together, and I know that they want to pursue holiness, but there's a blind spot. Like, that's what I would want people to do with me. So I do think it is a different conversation. We've kind of talked about both of them.
Yeah, I'm also a little careful in that. Yes, I don't know if we'll talk about the specificity of the sin that they're walking in, but in order for somebody to understand the need for a savior, they have to understand the dangers of sin, right? Plural, big picture. All of us have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the only reason I bring that up is that we do live in a day and age that if we're not careful, we do create a gospel that is absent of the need of Christ and more of this therapeutic. He's good. He's like a crystal. You can say the right thing and it'll make you feel good in the right moment, you know, like manifesting Jesus deal versus, no, we are subject to sin. The penalty of that sin is death. But to your point, if I don't know a person, I'm not going to sit there in a place of judgment and start nitpicking some of these hot topics. And it's the difference between, you know, the type of evangelism that I've seen work where it's there's a heart behind it. There's good, strong conversation that, yes, leads to a point of conviction, but is not damning, versus the street preacher just screaming out random sins, hoping to catch somebody. From a place of condemnation, and that can be just as ugly.
Yeah.
So.
And I don't think I was saying I wouldn't address sin, but I probably wouldn't start with what seems like behavior modification. Whereas with some of my Christian friends, it might be like, hey, what were you doing last weekend? Like, I know that's not who you are. And it might start with the behavior that's leading to the heart versus kind of starting with the heart leading to Jesus. But yeah, we don't want to water down the gospel, and that includes the weight of our sin, right back at sin. So that's kind of the choice of being carriers of the disease, or how to interact in a world where we do have people carrying this disease of sin. But then the other choice that we have is to be carriers of the antidote, which is much, much more fun to talk about. And you have this quote from Oswald Chambers. I don't know who found it, but I love it. Both rooms that I was in, there was like this audible gasp reading it that says, we have this idea that we can dedicate our gifts to God. However, you cannot dedicate what is not yours. There's actually only one thing you can dedicate to God, and that is your right to yourself. So I want to talk about what it means to give ourselves. We talk about giving our gifts a lot, using our gifts, serving with our gifts. What's the difference?
It kind of goes to what Paul was saying. I think I can give my gift, I can give of my time, I can give of my skill set, but I'm not still giving you all of myself. For me to give him permission to have all of me, he's having just that. Every single area of my life, I'm giving him myself completely. And you can't really debate what that word completely means. It's you entirely. That's everything that makes your life what it is. So I think that's the huge difference. Like, for me to give God and dedicate him something he just gave me sounds kind of crazy, but we do that all the time, and we feel as though we should be rewarded for that. The true sacrifice is me choosing to give him everything, what I stand for and what I want to do, and the things that I want to hold back, the things I want to hide, the things that I don't want to do. I give him permission to do it all and to subject my life to him. So it's that was a powerful statement from Oswald. Ozzy.
That's right.
Is it From My Utmost for His Highest?
Yeah.
It's a good book.
One of the many volumes.
Yeah.
Wow. Look at you. You're so smart.
Well, it's like his famous devotional, but
Yeah.
he wrote a lot of stuff.
He did.
Any other thoughts? It's hard when there are three of you because I'm like, I want to make sure
No,
everyone gets to
100%.
talk.
No, no, just giving ourselves wholly. It just, PJ said in first service at North, it includes your weaknesses. And that's something that kind of wrecked me. It's like, no, Jesus wants every single bit of me, not just what looks good. And I think that there are seasons in our lives where he wants to even use those weaknesses to show his glory. And I just never want to hide that from the Lord. After realizing that, I'm like, wow, he could work with it all,
Yeah.
And all of those holy experiments, they
Yeah.
succeed. So it was just a really cool statement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a freedom here that we sometimes don't fully preach because it sounds like it's a lofty cost. If I'm going to give everything like that you're asking a lot of me. But the freedom on the other side of that is who I give myself to is the one who is now responsible for myself. So I give myself fully trusting that the one I give myself to will provide. I give myself fully to the one that I give myself to because I'm fully confident and trust that he'll direct. Often we ask the Lord for seasons like, I need direction, I need provision, and it doesn't come the way that we think it could. And we get frustrated, but often it's because we haven't given ourselves completely. And so if you haven't given yourself completely, then who have you given yourself to? Which normally it's yourself. So then it now is incumbent on you to create the direction and the provision. So I've often taught this passage in a light of freedom. There's a freedom that comes when I say, no, it's all you. And I'm not worried about my opinion, and I'm not worried about my perceptions, or it's all yours. And so because it's all yours, I can depend on you for direction, provision, resource, strength, power, love, all these things that I'm in so much desperate need of, but it does come at the other side of full surrender.
I also think there have been seasons in my life where I started to coast in my walk with God, and even in ministry. And like when we talk about gifts and using our gifts for the glory of God, like that's a great thing. But I think sometimes, like without even realizing it, I've gotten to the point where like I was only giving God my gifts, but it's because I felt like that's all I had to offer. And then there are seasons where I'll be like, this isn't logical, but I feel like whatever happened, either through a boss or a job change or something like that, now I'm not using this gift, this thing that I thought was like, it's the ultimate thing to give this gift to God. And in those seasons, like it's been really humbling, but also a good realization of like, no, he wants my whole self. Like he wants my obedience. If that's in a season of sitting, I haven't shared this story in a while, but when I first came to Center City, which became Hope City West, I had been working at another church. The church was like 60 people big at most, including kids. They could have used someone with my gift set, but Pastor David just sensed in me the lack of health that was there and said, for 1 year, you're not allowed to do anything. Like you're not setting up a chair, you're not serving in kids, you're not sending any emails or doing anything. Like you need to just have a season where you can sit. And some of that was really nice, but some of it was hard because I'd gotten used to this idea of like, well, no, the only way I give myself to God is if I'm giving my gifts to God. And I had to learn like, no, God cares more about who I am than what I do. Like the thing we say all the time. So I think it's helpful to remember that in that sense too. Like you aren't just your gifts.
Yeah.
You are your weaknesses too. And like all of it is an act of worship in seasons. Then the joke got that I went a lot longer than a year without serving, but it's fine because now I serve full time.
Love that.
Yeah, it was a long time. But anyway, so we talk about giving yourself to God, and then you talk about knowing your motivation. And this one was a little challenging because I think we buy into some of this prosperity gospel that we wouldn't call prosperity gospel. So you talked about everything God has done, and that if he didn't do anything else, that would be enough. I think that's actually a much harder statement. It's easier to say than it is to actually believe. And my my heart goes out to people who are realizing like maybe that's, I don't know if I could say that. How would you encourage someone who's wanting to grow, who's wanting to love the Lord, who's wanting to be totally grateful, but is like, man, I don't know if I could separate my motivation from wanting God to give me more of this thing or that, whatever that thing may be. Just how would you encourage someone in that moment?
I think sometimes we play mind games in statements like that a little bit. It's like, even if he doesn't do a single another good thing in our lives, it's worth it. But at the same time, knowing God, ultimately he is good. So why would we put ourselves in that situation? But it's the truth. And it was something that we needed to highlight in that moment. But it's like, that's not going to happen. So it's like, don't worry about it. Just kind of like taking that thought captive.
Yeah, I think for us, the challenge is how do we communicate it so it's not transactional? And I think that's what Paul is saying here. Like, he's saying because of all that he's done, you can completely give yourself over to him. So we can trust that, not that God's going to stop doing good things, but that God's good. And so because he's done all this, because he's made a way by which you can be made right, because he's given his life in order that you could find life, because he gives you a remedy to the thing that keeps us from full life, because of all those things, you should offer yourself over completely as a living sacrifice. And so I think the danger to the other side of this is if I'm good enough, I'll earn the sacrifice. If I'm good enough, I'll earn the sacrifice. So then when God doesn't show up because of his sovereign timing, we instantly equate it to, well, I didn't do the right thing because it's transactional. So Paul is fighting a culture in Rome that very much is you earn your direction and you earn your position in the heart of your God through activity. He's saying, no, the activity's been done. It's more than enough. You simply have to believe that it's been done. And I do think that specifically in 2025, a lot of that prosperity kind of concept that, it's easy to kind of bash on these churches that are kind of name it and claim it and lay that all out. But even within the wider evangelical church, they might not say they're prosperity thinking, but they live in this plate of constant shame, guilt, and anxiety trying to earn a favor that they already have. So I think that was the attempt within Paul's writing and even in the Sunday's message to say, no, he's done it all already. And it's enough.
Yeah.
It's more than enough. So.
Yeah. So the verse is Romans 12:1. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all he has done for you. And I had an interesting conversation. I think it was in between services. It may have been before the first service with Dom Patterson. Shout out to Dom, Rihanna, and Penelope.
Dom.
We love them. Just sharing a praise report from a prayer request that had been submitted to the pastors and elders and how God had come through. And we talked about that Old Testament concept of how they would like put Ebenezers or like piles of stones in places where God had come through, and came up with this idea of like, we have those in our lives. Like this praise report that he was sharing, was like, that's the top stone on your Ebenezer now, of like, next time we're in a place where you're thinking like, oh my gosh, is he going to come through? Like, I really need this thing. I'm really wrestling. You can look back at not just what he's done for you in the salvation sense, which absolutely is more than we'll ever understand, but also like in your life. So what would be one of your more recent stones that would go on your pile of rocks of remembrance of what God's done for you? It doesn't have to be big. He's done that much? Just kidding. It's after lunch.
No, for me, it's some health issues that I've been navigating lately. Just being able to see God work in his sovereignty, utilizing the gifts of some incredible doctors, have been able to find the right regimen to bring some of my issues under control. So to God be the glory. It's allowed me to start getting back into some of the things that I love. So that's been cool.
I love that.
So does that mean no more excuses on the basketball court then?
Oh no, there's plenty of excuses on the basketball court.
Still old.
Yeah.
Got that card.
Ouch.
I think for me, one would be, I think seeing, and a lot of people would not know this, I think seeing a shift that God has been doing within Marilyn's life. There's just, she's always dealt a lot with depression and different things. And to almost see just some of the heaviness taken off of her, and to see and hear more desires of what she wants. It's kind of been refreshing to see that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that is awesome.
I think that over the last few years, I've been dealing with grief a lot after losing so many people in 1 year. I lost my mom, my brother, my uncle, my brother-in-law, and then we lost a baby in a miscarriage. And so I think that there was just this dark cloud hanging over my life. And really this year, I just found this mental freedom over my life that I didn't really think was possible. And through this, I mean, we always talk about it, and I feel so horrible, but through this transition, I've just been able to see a different side of God than I've ever seen before. And even my husband, John Wayne, he says there's just such a weight lifted off of you. And, you know, like I really have felt like there's this light at the end of the tunnel, and I really see the hope in Jesus. And that's nothing I've ever really seen before. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's mine. Just
I
that
love
kind of
that.
mental shift. So,
I think that's awesome. Mine's silly in comparison, but that's who God is. He shows up in the little and in the big. This past week was just kind of a crazy week for my family. My grandmother was in the hospital. She's out now recovering, but I had a late night drive to Greensboro with my mom, and basically a whole night without sleep. And kind of similar to you, like for the last 21 years, I think, I've really struggled with migraines, and sleep is one of my biggest triggers. But over the last 4 months, just working with a doctor and adjusting some of my diet, I've not had a migraine in the last 4 months. So to really like see, first there was a moment where I went to pick my mom up, and you guys, I talk about ladybugs all the time on this podcast now, but it was like 11 o'clock at night, and there was a ladybug just crawling across the front of the door as I was opening the door to pick my mom up. That was just like, it's going to be okay. You're going to stay awake for this whole drive. Cause I was so like, what if I fall asleep? But then to see his faithfulness, which could have been a mix of miraculous in the moment, but also working ahead of the moment to have me in a place where I could do that and not skip a beat. Like, yeah, I was tired the next day, but didn't have a headache. I think you were even surprised when you called to check on me, and I was like, hey, what's going on?
Yeah.
Like, not that I was focused on what was going on there, but just to see his faithfulness in that and know, like, if there's a season where I struggle with health stuff again in the future, like, he's still been faithful in this, and I want to celebrate every one of those moments. So I did in all caps, sent it to the staff that was like, I don't have a migraine today.
It's awesome.
Yeah, he is faithful. And I would challenge whoever's watching this to kind of figure out what some of your stones are. I think a lot of times we'll pray for things or we'll struggle through things and we'll call out to the Lord, and then he's faithful and we move on to the next thing. And that's not something to feel shame over, because we're all human and life keeps coming. But stop and figure out what are some of those things that he's done for you, because that builds the gratefulness that then leads to the just having a much easier time being a living sacrifice.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, it's like nothing to lay my life down for God, who's already laid his life down for me and done all of these things on top of that. So now we get into patterns. Maybe not the last point, but the next last point was don't copy the world's behavior. That's how we are carriers of the antidote. And so you all had illustrations about patterns, and while yours were both wonderful, I want you to tell us about socks. Because I didn't even know where you were going when you started this, and I'd read the message, but everyone can understand this. So
Yeah, so like when we segued to that, I was like, trust me, I'm going somewhere with this. And we were just talking about socks. So I was like, how many of y'all like new pairs of socks? And some people rose their hands. And so I asked them, how many of y'all, your socks have to match? And then I was like, how many of y'all like, different types of socks, loud colors, different patterns, some of them. I was like, how many of y'all just don't care? So I was like, cool, now we know where everyone are with socks, and we good. And I was just telling them I like new socks, clean socks. I keep a stash hidden because my kids always end up not having socks, and then they end up in my drawer. So I got a white pair of Nike socks hidden.
where are they hidden? No one will
It's
know.
hidden in plain sight so that they'll never find it. And, whenever I'm ready and I got maybe a new pair, or I just, I'll put them on it. we were just talking about how socks, when you wear them for a long period of time during the day, could leave imprints. Now, I feel like back in the day, the elastic used to be way more like just tough because the indents used to be deep.
Yeah.
And you'll roll your socks off and you're itching your calf because of where it's at. Now it's just like this subtle imprint if it's there for a long time, and it's that soft mark over several hours of just having that pressure on you. And we just kind of segue, that's oftentimes how culture is. It's that small, subtle imprint that it's the pressure that's around you. It's not bothering you. You're not mindful of it. It's not shouting in your face, but it's very easy for it to find itself imprinting on you. And before you know it, you're doing things you never actually thought about. So that's kind of how we went with the sock ordeal.
I like it because you don't notice, like, unless your socks are really tight all day long, you're not aware, like, that they're doing anything to your skin. It's when you get home and take your socks off, and then you're like, oh, I can still see the pattern on there. And I just love the subtlety of that. And it may be because I don't work with clay, but I like picture you having to push a little harder to get that pattern in. Because it is subtle sometimes. Like, again, it's not the drug dealer around the corner.
Yeah.
It's just a pattern of like, what are you leaning against that you don't even realize you're leaning against until it's forming who you are. So what are some of these patterns that you recognize that maybe someone just wants to spend some time this week examining their heart? What questions would you tell people to ask to figure out what are you leaning on? Where are the patterns of the world impacting you?
Yeah, I think, again, to just kind of highlight the way the enemy works, obviously there's not one set pattern. So there are patterns, to John's point, there is that intentional pressing, that there are certain patterns that are like that. There are others that are a little bit more subtle that we find ourselves just walking into. But I definitely feel like just like when someone's phone goes off during the podcast where they know they're supposed to mute it, she'll feel the pressure later.
She's feeling it right now.
I'm so sorry.
I just think we have to be mindful that it's not just one side way. Some pressures are, you feel the force, like you have to. Think about, and I'm not even trying to go down this rabbit trail, but think about when COVID was here. There was a circle of believers that were adamant about the shots we were supposed to get, the
vaccines.
The vaccines, and then it was a crowd that was very loud, that was like, be proactive, be responsible, care about others. There was another group that was very kind of suspicious about it. They didn't feel good about it. They kind of felt this way. This group felt this way. Even something as small as that, even though it was significant, the pressure was right there in your face. Some pressures are like that, where you kind of feel forced to have to take a side. Other pressures, because they're all around us, you don't really feel and notice what it's doing. I think the enemy works in multiple different ways, so it's so important that we're on guard constantly, and hopefully biblically practicing community around us, that when I miss it or I don't see it or I'm so tired, I'm just not even trying to think about it, someone else can pull me aside and say, yo, I've noticed. I don't know if you've noticed, I've noticed this. So I think we got to be on guard, but with the right people around us, they can help us too when we feel like we're not on guard. But I think the pressure comes in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the ways to kind of know is what, fruit is a word that we use often. Like, your patterns will dictate your fruits. So if you're living constantly in a place where all you're producing is anger, all you're producing is like leaning into some selfishness, there's a good chance that the patterns around you have kind of set. And it's so funny because when you kind of examine it that way, how many people are like surprised when they do the introspection on what is the thing that they're leaning on that's actually creating those patterns in us. So I think, when Paul says don't conform to the patterns of the world, I think there's two thoughts. First, you have to determine what you're going to allow to press into you. And then in order to do that, you have to determine what's not. And so he then turns around, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So there is a process of renewal that's necessary. And in that process of renewal, sometimes it'll reveal patterns that have been pressed in that you have to do the work of. So all of that to simply say it is the Spirit of God working in our heart through the tool of conviction that will often reveal to us what are those patterns, what do we have to be careful of. There's some, I have found that some of the pressures are obvious, like some of the patterns are obvious. You're like, okay, well, there are some obvious standards biblically that have been laid out, big picture things. But some of the small, minute stuff, the stuff that goes a little bit under the radar.
Pressure like a drip, drip, drip. That'll never stop.
There you go.
Thank you for knowing the reference.
Yeah. So within the scope of that, I lost my train of thought. But
Sorry.
for the most part, that's hopefully there's something there.
I
Yeah.
almost quoted Encanto earlier.
Did you?
Yeah. but it's
Yeah,
okay.
I woke up with the song stuck in my head, I think, because I was listening to your message last night before I went to bed.
What's been in my head is,
what the
oh,
reference
what a
was. Now I
night.
got it.
You know that song?
Yeah, she sings the pressure like a drip, drip, drip. Because I was thinking about how gentle it can be, like to the sock illustration, how we can't notice. But then I think sometimes in that correction, you have to lean hard into the right kind of pressure. Because then I just had this image. I literally woke up with this, like I wasn't overthinking it. That's like, no, when someone's wounded, what they need is pressure on the wound. Like when someone's bleeding and wounded, there is a time where like you need to lean into the heaviness of the pressure. And I haven't worked through that whole thought, but
Well, there's no such thing as the middle.
yeah.
That like I think that's a misnomer too. Well, I'm just not going to be pressured by anything. That's nonsense, right?
Yeah.
So you have to choose what to lean into, otherwise you just fall.
Yeah.
So I think Paul is quick to be like, no, that's the reason why you need to set your mind on things above. Like this isn't just saying no to bad stuff. You have to focus on what is right and what is holy and what is good and what is pure, to set your mind on the things that the Spirit would have you set your mind on versus the pressures of, kind of leaning into the sinful pattern. So
Yeah, and I think of the analogy you used about like falling asleep in class on your sleeve and stuff. And
I didn't understand that analogy.
Oh my goodness, you're so perfect.
No, I'm just a nerdy student. That's all.
So I have hypersomnolence. So in high school, I would stand up and I would fall asleep standing up in chorus.
Wow.
And I would fall on the person next to me. And it was so embarrassing, but it's okay.
Sounds pretty embarrassing.
It was. But anywho, so I'm thinking of your analogy of the sleeve. And what we already know is that in a few minutes, it'll go away.
Yeah.
And something that rocked my mind whenever I was thinking about it is what happens in those moments where you don't have time for it to, like if we were on the podcast and, you would see the pattern, but how do I act in those moments where like I'm caught off guard and have that mark on my face? What is on my face kind of thing?
I almost used a Tommy Boy reference.
Who's Tommy Boy?
Tommy Boy is a movie from the 90s with
David Spade.
David Spade and Chris Farley. They get into an argument in the fight.
SNL guys.
You don't know who Chris Farley is?
It
Oh,
wasn't
man.
that funny. They love him, but I don't
You're
get it.
out of your mind. Anyway,
Yeah,
there's a
I thought it
scene in
was
that
funny.
movie where they get into a fight.
Oh, is it that guy who just died?
He didn't just die.
Not just
Oh.
die. Like maybe even before you were born, he died, apparently.
I
But
was in 6th grade when he died.
Yeah, no.
I'm never going to get to the end of the story.
Sorry.
It is
No,
a
go
good
ahead.
story. I love the analogy. Keep going.
So they get into a fight, and Chris Farley is a lot bigger than David Spade. So he punches him, and Chris Farley's like, "Did I just feel a wind draft?" So then he punches him as hard as he can. He's like, "Oh, did your mom fight?" or something stupid like that. In the next scene, Chris Farley takes a 2x4 and slams it on his face. He's like, "Oh, that one hurts," right? So that's the scene. The next scene, they're at a restaurant. He's like, they're showing this the left side of Chris Farley's face is where the camera's on. And they're eating food, and Chris Farley says, "I mean, there's not a mark here. Like, it's not right here, but it's right here." They show the right side of his face, and there's just this huge mark on his face where he hit him with the 2x4. He's like, "No, I don't see nothing." And the waitress comes over and says, "Oh my gosh, what happened to your face?" But there's this moment where he didn't want to get in trouble, but he to your point, he was wearing the markings of
Yeah.
the 2x4. I think often we wear the scarrings of that pattern. We wear that pattern, and to your point, sometimes it's not even noticeable to us, but it is noticeable to others.
And it's like if we don't point that out to the people who we love, then we're just encouraging them.
Yeah,
So it's just like the
full circle.
full circle. Yeah, it's just like the modeling clay on the little things. I could have just gone, seeing the hair imprints, I could have just gone and not smoothed it out. But then that wouldn't have been as good of a job. And did we still cover it with wallpaper? Absolutely. But, you know, it's just like those minute things, they make an impact. And like I said in my sermon, what is temporary at the time becomes, you know, eternal, the ephemeral to the eternal. And I don't want to get to heaven with hairlines on my clay.
Modeling clay of life.
Modeling clay of life. But yeah.
Yeah. So you talk about how we lean on Jesus, like what we do, that it's not a moment. Like a lot of times you think like, okay, God, transform my mind right now. But it can, and he can do anything in a moment. But a lot of times for us, it's through a process, and the focus really is on transforming our minds. Like that's where these patterns are built and these habits are built. So you say to refuse to set your mind on what is sinful and choose to set your mind on what is good and right. I think we're running low on time. So gray matter, it's a thing. Watch the sermon and then think about it every time you look at a screen for the next couple of days. But I want to talk about this renewing of the mind and focusing on verses that you talk about. Like in Romans, he says, let the Spirit control your mind, that leads to life and peace. But that's not what there's a verse somewhere in here that talks about setting your mind on things that are good or fixing your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right. And so I think there's a difference. Yeah, the Philippians one says fix your thoughts. There was one that was set your mind. It's somewhere.
Things above.
Yeah. Last week we made a point when we were talking about sin to say that there's a difference between feeling a desire in a moment and acting on it. But here we're talking about the importance of our thoughts and what we set our mind on. So I want to talk about the difference between having a thought in a moment versus what it means to take a thought captive, what that actually looks like. We use the phrase a lot, but like, what is taking a thought captive? And then setting our minds or fixing our minds on things for longer than just like, oh, I'm just noticing that thing and then it's gone. So that's the topic.
No, I think the way that our minds work is that we are uniquely designed to process through our eyes, our ears, our nose, and depending on who you are, those 5 senses, touch, so on and so forth, depending on who you are, some more than others, but really so much of that is what ends up being processed through those senses is all filtered first through the mind, right? So these things come in, they're filtered through the mind. We cannot stop that process. That's a part of human, you know, I'm looking here in the studio now and can choose to have 15 thoughts about that camera. I can choose to sit here and ponder that light blinding me. I can sit here and figure out why in the world it's so hot in this place.
It's very hot.
I'm dying.
I'm regretting my jacket. It's fine.
So that is a part of, and we can, believe it or not, process a lot of thought in a quick amount of time. Our brains are stinking genius. The problem is that we don't differentiate between processing, like this thing that comes in our mind, and then the things that we think on. So it's different between getting an idea, getting a thought. It's different than spending time and thinking on that thought. How much time am I talking about in my head thinking about the air conditioning? Like, am I considering the solutions? What's the problem? Instead of focusing on the thing I'm supposed to do. Like, I have to make that decision in the mind. To set your mind to means I'm intentionally making sure that I'm spending more time focused on things that honor the Lord. So I am controlling and spending time controlling what I'm allowing in my eyes, what I'm allowing in my ears, what am I touching, what, you know, again, to all those senses. And I do think that Paul was specific here, that in the setting of our minds, that means that I am doing the work of exposing myself more to things that honor the Spirit of God than exposing myself to things that honor my sinful nature. So exposure is what it means to set your mind. Then he also, in other passages, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, but this is where I wish, cutting room floor, we can kind of push it all together. There is a passage of capturing thoughts, because the capturing of thoughts is what dictates what moves from a moment observation to thinking on. We capture that thought. That muscle has been depleted culturally. We are obsessed with gathering information. We are not good at processing what's good thought versus what's bad thought. Between what some would call fake news, what others would be called just an oversaturation of influencers and experts, which I would argue they're not really experts. We even just had a conversation a couple minutes ago about people in our lives who are regurgitators of information, not necessarily gleamers of knowledge. They're not reading books. They're listening to people who've read books. And so because we don't work that muscle, everything just passes through, where the writing of scripture introduces this ability that we need to hold every thought capture and put it up against the standard that God has for us. So although we're observing and careful to what we observe because we're setting our minds on things that are above, there are moments that even in those positive things, we have to, where does this go? How does this work? Where does this fit? And then when those negative things come up, we're able to recognize them, to label them and move them to where they appropriately belong, right? Like to skirt them out of, I don't need to focus on that. It's funny because even from a practical place, growing up, it was always bounce the eyes, bounce the eyes, bounce the eyes. But I've learned even in content, I have to bounce the eyes. There's moments where I'm just, whether reading a magazine or watching a movie or scrolling through my phone, where I have to stop the moment in order to capture the thought and move it away. I can't focus on this anymore. Subject it to the person and the nature of Jesus, and then remove that thing from my thinking in order to make space for the things that really matter, the things that are going to grow me. So I don't know if that answered your question per se, but I do think that that's the process. We are observant of a million thoughts a day. What we hold captive and allow through is what we set our hearts on, and then ultimately God uses those things to shape and mold us.
And I would say just because you think it doesn't mean it's true.
No.
And we've hit this point, like if we do process where the thought comes in and then it's like, oh, that must be who I am, versus, no, now I have the discipline and the responsibility to take this and weigh it against scripture and not immediately believe it because I thought it.
Exactly.
And I think we're really quick these days to be like, I thought this thing, that's true now.
Here's a very unpopular thought. I would argue that there's less original thought than you think, that a majority of our thinking is a product of exposure.
It's like there's nothing new under the sun.
Yes.
That's in the Bible.
I know people hate that phrase. And there's
It's in the Bible.
I hear you. But what I mean by that is I think we scream to, no, I want to be original. Every song has been inspired by another song. Every work of art's been inspired by something an artist has seen. Even if it's not another piece of art, it could be nature. It could be what you're seeing here. So like to some degree, there's not original thought. So if that's the case, what thoughts are you allowing in? And to your point, subjecting every one of those thoughts to the standard and the filter of scripture is what makes us who we are.
Yeah, I think something to note is, we talk about the sins being like cravings. And so when do I crave things? I crave things when I'm bored, and I crave things whenever I'm starving myself. So spiritually, if we're craving something, first of all, cravings are, I have to have it and I have to have it now, and I really don't think that it's particularly in the Lord's nature to be so short, work on such a short timing. And I don't think it's a live or die situation. So, maybe some situations it is, but identifying this and asking the root question, oh, am I bored? Or like, have I not entertained, the thought of Jesus in a while? Or am I unhealthy? What am I doing that's, prohibiting me from being at the foot of the cross? I think those are questions to ask whenever you're feeling those cravings of sin, so.
Okay. Cutting room floor. I
you
know
got
some of
mine
it came
already.
up.
You got mine.
John?
I'm good.
One
You got
day
it all
he's going
out?
to say something. We're going to be like, what?
That took so much time to think.
Yeah.
All right. Well, where are we headed?
We are headed, John, why don't you give him a highlight where we're headed next week?
Next week is Pastor Emma's running for
Yeah.
on that one.
You're the only one here
Pastor
who's
John,
preaching next
can
week.
you,
I'm really
let me know
excited
what we're
about it.
doing?
We begin our conversation on unity. And so, no, it's not next week.
No.
What's next week?
The one you did this morning.
I know.
Yeah.
Justification.
Justification.
Do a little editing.
Cannot
Chop
wait.
it up.
It's going to be
Should
amazing.
have just stuck with John G.
You need
Yeah.
to go to Mr. Miyabi on that one.
That's it. Being justified, which it includes a lot of strong legal imaging. and I can't wait. It's going to be a lot of fun. We worked through 4 weeks worth of sermons in one sitting, so that's why I was a little foggy. And it's also hot as all get out in here.
It is. I thought it was just me.
Yeah, but so that's where we're going. Justification. This is at a core issue within the constructs of our faith, and Paul does a phenomenal job communicating this clearly. So it's one of those easy messages that we can't wait to jump into.
Yeah. So Sunday,
Yeah.
9 and 11 at our North and West Expressions. We'll see you then.